Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I'm going to give it one more minute for people to be joining, and then I'll get started. Brilliant. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining. The first thing to say is if you have any questions through this presentation, please use the Q&A function. Most of you will be familiar with Zoom and will know about this, but if you aren't, then that's different to the chat, and that's where I'll be looking at the end of this presentation for any questions that come up. I will be trying to stick to about 45 minutes. We've got lots to cover, and then I'll stick around and answer as many questions as possible. If you do have a longer, more complex question, then I'd say it's worth contacting us directly. That's at oxbridgeapplications.com, where you'll find all of our contact details, or info@oxbridgeapplications.com, where you can email us. So, navigating Oxbridge interviews. The first thing to say is congratulations. Take a moment to congratulate yourselves. You are either someone who has submitted your application this year, in which case, enormous congratulations, or if you are a parent or teacher or guardian, also massive congratulations for supporting your young person through it. This is not a small feat. You are applying to one of the most competitive universities in the world, which means you're already doing excellently and you're likely to continue doing excellently whether or not you happen to be an offer holder in January. And you've also chosen to watch this webinar, so you're taking action to get prepared for your possible interviews. My name is Theo. So I did my first degree at Cambridge. I studied human, social, political sciences, which is a range of social sciences. Then went on to do an arts degree at Guildhall and a more science-focused degree at Birkbeck. I've advised over the past 10 years or so thousands of university applicants and held just as many mock interviews. So we're coming up to mock interview season this year when applicants from all over the country and beyond the country will want to be practicing their interview skills. So I'll be taking lots of mock interviews in a range of different subjects. And I work for Duke's Education, particularly in the higher education consultancies. This talk is from Oxbridge Applications, and we're specialist in Oxbridge and UK university advising. Been around for a long time now, so nearly 26 years. We're all Oxbridge graduate tutors and academics interested in helping younger students and applicants make the most of their applications and reach their potential. That's why I'm doing this talk today. We do lots of work with access partners, schools across the country, and we also are a tuition company, so we offer paid tuition and consultancy services as well. So today I'm going to go through a brief introduction to Oxbridge interviews, why they happen, what they look like. But I'm then going to go a little bit into detail into the types of questions you could expect to get. And then I'll talk about some subject differences. So depending on what kind of discipline you're applying for, that will determine the sorts of questions you're going to be asked. I'll then go into some communication tips. So this will be not so academic, but more how could you portray yourself as well as possible in your interviews, the sorts of things I tend to see in mock interviews, and the kinds of advice we tend to give students. And then some practical tips. So what could you be doing from now until your December interviews, which, touch wood, you'll be invited to in mid to late November. All of this information is either directly from Oxford or Cambridge's websites. It's also written in collaboration with Oxford and Cambridge interviewers who I work closely with, previous Oxford and Cambridge interviewers, I should say. as well as informed by our yearly surveys. So we survey many, many students each year, get a really good idea about what the interview questions are like year on year, and how the process is being run. So, an introduction to Oxford interviews. Interviews are the final stage of the application process. Not everyone is invited to interviews. For Oxford, the percentage of applicants can vary widely by course. So, for a course like economics and management, it's a feat to get through to the interview. So, they only interview about 25 to 30% of applicants. The aim for Oxford is to shortlist to around 2.5 applicants per place at the interview stage, whereas at Cambridge, the general interview rate is a bit higher and more consistent, with all applicants who have a reasonable chance taken through to the interview. So Cambridge has a policy of deselection, so some people are deselected from the process, whereas Oxford have a more heavy shortlisting process. The interview is not the be all and end all of your application, but it is important. It takes a lot of investment of time and resources for Oxford and Cambridge to run these interviews. And so you can infer from that that it's really important for them in their application process. They've kept this going for a large number of years now, and it's such an integral part of the way that they admit students. Why do they do this? Is it cruelty? Well, the main reason is to check suitability for the teaching system at Oxford or Cambridge, which is centered around these very small group supervisions or tutorials. Supervisions or tutorials, which you can see one happening here in person, happen in addition to the regular teaching methods, such as lectures and labs and seminars. When you're a student at Oxford and Cambridge, you have 1 to 2 of these small group teaching sessions every week on top of everything else. This session is not a lecture from a supervisor where you go and just listen to someone giving you feedback and that's it. It's a discussion. So, feedback on pieces of work you've done may be given in order to help you improve your essay technique or your problem solving approach. But for most of the time, the academic hosting the session helps you go deeper into the topic. So, they'll be asking probing questions, a bit like the Socratic method, with ideas are discussed and debated between not only you and the academic, but sometimes other students as well. So the maximum amount of students is usually 3 to 1 academic. So how do these interviews run? They're usually 20 to 30 minutes long. The vast majority of interviews happen online. For Oxford, all interviews are happening online in 2025. For Cambridge, the majority of interviews are happening online in 2025. Some colleges are interviewing in person. So if you didn't realize that and you're a Cambridge applicant, you may find yourself going to Cambridge in person in December. Some colleges at Cambridge are interviewing for certain subjects in person only. They tend to be the more STEM-focused subjects. They are almost always led by 2 academics, based in and sometimes around the subject area that you're applying for. So they may teach on the faculty occasionally, they may be affiliated with the faculty. One of them may be the main tutor based at the college that you've applied for, or the director of studies if you're applying for Cambridge. And you usually get 2 of them. Yes, I usually. I got one longer interview, lasted about 50 minutes, 55 minutes, but most people get 2 interviews that last about 25 minutes each. And these happen in December for the vast majority of people. A couple of people have had very early interviews, but I believe the schedules are all based in December this year. When do you get your invites to interview? When do you find out if you're getting an interview? That happens in mid to late November. So it can be as late as just 1 week before your actual interviews. So if you're uncertain whether you're going to be given an interview, make sure that you're still preparing and still thinking about how you might approach that interview, because the interim between the invitation and going to your interview can be pretty narrow. When you're given your invitation, you're usually told a fair amount of detail. So exactly when they're happening, what format they'd be happening on, if you should expect to use some kind of online whiteboard if you're applying for a mathematical subject, exactly who will be taking your interviews as well. So it's useful in the sense that you're able to get a little bit more information about what to expect. What sorts of things will you talk about in your interview? You might talk a bit about why you're interested in the subject, so your motivation. You might be going through some debates or problems, questions related to the subject. There could be some objects, so unseen graphs or texts or images, sometimes even videos and so on, that can be given to you to look at immediately before your interview, sometimes an hour before, or during the interview itself. And anything that you've submitted. So that could mean your personal statement, it could mean your written work, um, and it could mean anything special that you had to produce for the subject that you applied for. So, what matters in an interview? And I will be going through the content of the interview in detail. But what sort of things matter? Whether you're introverted or extroverted. So, people who are slightly shy or nervous about the interview sometimes worry that Oxford and Cambridge are looking for these outspoken, confident people. In reality, many people at these universities are very introverted. There is no Oxbridge personality that they are looking for. There's a large variety of different personality types. Um, you just need to be able to discuss your subject with the interviewers. So, as long as you're able to have a conversation in the interview situation, then you're perfectly suitable to the Oxbridge teaching system. Similarly, they don't discriminate if you are neurodiverse or you have a learning or other disability. Many people studying at teaching at Oxbridge are neurodiverse or have a disability. So if you think, if you're one of those people and you think it may affect you in the interview, simply let them know so that they can make any necessary allowances for you. The second thing that does not matter is your socio-economic background. They're not looking for students from a certain school type. They have no quotas or biases in this way. A lot of the training done with Oxbridge interviewers is to ensure fairness and remove this bias from the process. The only way that socioeconomic data is used is to level the playing field. So when a student has individual circumstances which may pose disadvantages, for example, if they'd spent lots of time in local authority care, if they are a forced migrant, other special extenuating circumstances, this would not qualify those students for lower offers, I should say, but it would help the university understand the context in which their achievements occurred. Third thing is cultural background. Academics themselves come from a wide array of cultural backgrounds, and diversity in this way is only a good thing. It means for a more interesting and healthy academic environment. Lots of students apply and are accepted from across the world and from across many different kinds of cultural and religious backgrounds. Your hobbies, maybe that's drama, music, embroidery, whatever it might be somewhere in your application, so your statement or your reference, and maybe they'll ask you about them just to get to know you a bit. But they don't hold weight for Oxford or Cambridge in their decision making because they're looking at academic factors. If you happen to be applying to US colleges, they absolutely do. But for Oxford and Cambridge, they're not a strong factor in the decision making process. And finally, there's a myth around what you want to do in the future. So some people think this really matters. Careers and higher education destinations are sometimes elided and blurred together at school, and rightly so. Higher education is a stepping stone to certain employability prospects, certain vocations. But unless you are applying for a vocational course, like medicine, it's not important to the interviewers what you intend to do after your course. Even for a subject like law, you may want to be a lawyer. You may want to be a lawyer. That's absolutely fine. But you may have no idea yet. Plenty of people are excellent law undergraduates, graduating with top firsts, and then go into something completely different afterwards. The people who are interviewing you are academics. So remember that that is their primary passion. Likewise, you don't need to fake an ambition to do a PhD in the subject or something very closely related to the subject. If you genuinely want to and they happen to ask you, which they likely won't, then that's fine to say. But please don't manufacture this because you can always tell if something is manufactured. So, what does matter? Enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is so important because regardless of how bright you might be, how many A stars you have at A level or GCSE, if you are not enthusiastic or motivated enough to work on this degree, you are really going to struggle to keep up with the work. And you'll also struggle to produce good work. Secondly, teachability. So being teachable doesn't mean how good are you at learning things generally. They know your grades, your predictions, what your teachers are saying about you. Teachability in this context is the extent to which you suit the small group teaching system which Oxford and Cambridge are known for, and I've already mentioned. This involves discussing your subject, your motivation, and problems and ideas relating to the subject. This does not mean they're looking for a specific personality type again, but it does mean that you need to show that the tutorial or the supervision system is one in which you will thrive and you'll be happy. The ability to think critically and independently. This is crucial for doing well in any undergraduate subject. Critical and independent thinking. So, what's your own take on this topic? What do you think about this debate? There's a problem, there's a gap in this debate. So, how do you think it should be filled? What's your evaluation? And so on. That sort of thing will take you from a good degree classification, a 2-2 or a 2-1, to a very good one, a first or a starred first. Showing signs of this in your application, elements of thinking critically, evaluatively, and independently, what connections are you making between things, is a really good sign in your application and your interviews, particularly, to show your potential to do well on the degree. And finally, your curiosity and openness. You're applying for a very intensive undergraduate course, 3 or more years of studying the subject, maybe a couple of different subjects. You're going to cover a huge array of new topics which you've never studied before. They need to know that you're going to be open for this and that you're curious about encountering new topics. Just to show that I'm not making this up, here is an interview assessor's form from Cambridge, which interviewers might use to make notes on the interviewees that they see. So you can see a few boxes here. There's some boxes around different forms of grades and identity. And for the interview in particular, there's what was discussed, what the applicant did well, what the applicant could improve on, summary of performance, and a score out of 10 from this interviewer. It's important to say that your chances are not dictated by a single interview or a single interviewer, because you'll likely have more than one interview, and that means you'll have more than one score. So you'll have more than one interviewer. The norm is to have 4 different scores or even more. And so you have lots of different comments. That means if you have really contrasting comments, you get a low score and you get a very high score, then they'll be able to look more deeply at the comments and try and reconcile why that might have happened. And remember, the interview is just one aspect of your application. Interview feedback forms can also be more subject specific. Here's one used in the recent past by English interviewers at Oxford. What I want to draw your attention to is that there are 6 boxes before the overall evaluation. So there's application, then there's 4 boxes for reasoning, and then there's 1 box for communication. 6 boxes, but 2 of them, application and communication, have nothing to do with English. That's 1/3 of your total score here. That has nothing to do with how many books you've read or whether you remembered that Shakespeare quote. The others, speaking of which, have nothing to do with knowledge. It's more a test of your academic skills and potential to succeed on the course. So here you can see your reasoning skills, which mean your ability to make an argument, distinguishing the relevant from irrelevant, ability to identify weaknesses, creativity, flexibility of thought. All of these have been identified by the faculty as critical academic skills to show potential for doing well on this course. Just for a bit of balance, here's one for physics at Oxford. Again, there are 5 factors here as opposed to 6. 2 of these, so 2 out of 5, are nothing to do with how good you might be at physics. motivation, and communication. That's a really substantial part of the degree of the interview. The other three do, but notice there is no mark for level of knowledge here either, or how much can they remember from their A level. They're looking primarily at your motivation, how well you suit the Oxbridge supervision or tutorial style of teaching, and your academic potential. So we'll move on to different question types. I think it's helpful to consider interview questions for Oxford and Cambridge interviews as falling into to four main categories. The first one is critical thinking questions. These are broad questions without any easy answer. So they're meant to be more conversation starters, and they tend to be quite difficult to approach, which is the whole point. Secondly, questions about you. These can come in many different forms. Could be about your motivation, something from your personal statement, something you've submitted, or something about your application more generally. Thirdly are direct questions. These are usually problems to solve with more of a definitive answer pathway, but they can go into an unseen direction. So you'll be introduced to new material and be forced to adapt to new information. But it may start off with something that looks a bit like an A-level question. And unseen document questions. These are really common across all types of subjects, where you focus on a resource which might be relevant to your subject and discuss it. You are absolutely not intended to have any knowledge about this graph or passage or picture that you're being shown. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. Critical thinking questions. How old is old? How big is a mountain? How much sand is there in the Sahara Desert? Who writes history? In a world full of angels, do we need laws? Should gorillas be given human rights? Are large or small companies more successful? Do animals think in the same way as humans? These seem fairly childlike questions in a way. They could even seem a bit silly or even obnoxious when first asked, but they actually lead to some important fundamental debates in academia. So, looking at the way that we approach these really big questions can tell them a lot about how you think and how you might approach a similar kind of question in a supervision or tutorial essay. So, how do you approach these kinds of questions? Firstly, be open to them. Don't panic. They can seem overwhelming at first, but that's the point. Secondly, one common thing is for interviewees to skip ahead and try to provide a definitive answer right away. Well, how big is a mountain? Everest is about 30,000 feet tall, or whatever it is. That doesn't make for an interesting answer. Instead, try to explore the question first to show you're aware that your answer is dependent on interpreting the key words in the sentence. What are the boundaries of a mountain? What does big mean? Why are we asking this question? So instead of thinking, what is the answer and I need to give it now, think first, what do I need to do to solve this question? What parameters do we need to set? What do we need to investigate beforehand? So think about these as conversation starters or discussion prompts. They're not waiting for you to produce a verbal essay, and they do not have a mark scheme in front of them where they're ticking off the right answer as it comes in. So in a way, this gives you a lot of freedom, and approach them as if you would a conversation with a friend. Secondly, questions about you. These could be questions from your personal statement. So, oh, you mentioned you did this work experience. Tell me more about it. Or you read this book. What did you think about this argument? Could be application or reference details. So, potentially, if you're applying for deferred entry, if you want to have a gap year, they may ask you a bit about your plans. Could be something about the essays that you've submitted if you're applying for a subject which asks for submitted essays. Again, there's no Oxbridge type. My advice here is don't feel you need to be formal here. They are people too. You'll be spending a lot of time with these people in a small group environment. So try to think about them more as colleagues rather than having a higher status than you and that you need to be formal in your answers. Actually, giving them a little bit of detail about you makes it more memorable. So be specific in your answers. Practice questioning your own statement material. People panic about personal statement questions because they think they might be asked, "Well, you read this book. You must know what's on page 120 then. What's in this chapter? What specifically is this quote?" That's very, very unlikely to come up because it's not going to tell them much about you. What can happen is if you're asked to talk a bit more about something that you've read or that you've done that relates to your subject. So, tell me more about this argument that you've read, or do you still think this, or you mentioned this, have you looked at anything else? One phrase we sometimes hear from admissions tutors is, "This person sounded rehearsed." Please, please, please do not have lines written down or memorized in response to questions because it's really easy to tell when someone is reading notes. Make notes for yourself to think through in advance, maybe put them in the form of a mind map or a brainstorm. But when you're asked something like, "Why are you applying for this course?" answer it organically and authentically as yourself. And also, a tip here is to keep engaging and reflecting until your interview time. So you've submitted your UCAS personal statement. Some of you might still be writing a Cambridge-specific short personal statement to submit. Don't leave it frozen in time. So go back to the topics that you've written about and try and find a couple more resources. Has there been any more news about the research in this area? Is there anything that this academic has come out with recently? If you can show that your interests are alive and evolving, then that's a really good sign that they're valid and genuine. Direct questions. So what sort of questions do these look like? Equations, translations, definitions, sometimes IQ test type questions, so logic-based questions, sometimes A-level based questions, so looking at the content in your A-level, as you might be looking at the MAT or the PAT at the moment, for example, and a question could start with some of the syllabus material that you've studied there, and they understand if you've not done A-levels and if you've studied IB, for example, instead. So don't worry if that's you, they will adjust their questions accordingly. These come up in STEM, so science, physics, maths, computer science, engineering, and logic-based subjects quite a lot. Also, I've put translations there. So the direct question might apply to something like classics or any language questions, language subjects. They are usually phrased in the form of problems to work through, but they often develop into more of a conversation after initial period of problem solving. The first thing to say, which you probably already heard, is after you've taken a bit of time to think, look at the problem, talk through your thought process. So talk about how you are approaching that problem. That might be unfamiliar to you now because it's not something that you tend to do, but believe me, it's really helpful in the interview setting because it simply saves time. If you are going in the wrong direction, then that's a quicker way that they can pull you to the right direction. And this is not a test of who can get the right answer most quickly. Plenty of applicants feel they did really badly on specific direct questions, but they end up getting places because they take prompts from the interviewers and articulate their thoughts well. So they begin speaking out loud. Secondly, persevere. One useful tip from a Cambridge medicine interviewer I know is to try and delay the point at which you say, "I don't know." And the way you do that is by taking the problem at hand and applying what you do know. It might be a completely unfamiliar type of question, but you recognize some of the elements of it. And so talk through that. Thirdly, be open, honest, and curious. If you don't remember something crucial, so an area of mathematics that you covered a while ago, you just can't remember what the equation was or the approach was or the process, then that's absolutely not a problem. It's important to make that known rather than bluff your way through. If you share your thinking out loud, then the interviewers will have picked up on that and prompt you in the right direction. Unseen document questions. These come up very frequently across all subjects, and this could be something given to you right before your interview or even live in the interview. What you're shown will depend on the subject you're applying for. Firstly, use what is there as well as what you know. Often students jump into an unseen document and make inferences, try to impress with the most sophisticated interpretation. In my experience, it's much better to begin with noticing what's there very closely, and only after establishing the detail in the document should you begin to make more analytical or evaluative points. Secondly, these are meant to be challenging and open up nuanced debates and ideas. So if there's information you think is missing or be useful to know, feel free to ask. They're there to explore what this teaching and learning relationship might be like. So they may not tell you the answers to the questions, but asking the questions will itself show curiosity. And thirdly, if this document, if it's a graph or a table or a passage or a poem, whatever it might be, reminds you of something you've already read, or if it contrasts with something in an interesting way, feel free to mention that because that will only help to bring out an ingredient of the text by contrast or similarity, and will help to show your curiosity as well. So those are the main four types of questions to expect in your interviews. Now we'll talk a little bit about the differences between subjects and one top tip for each main subject area. There's a lot of similarity between interviews um, because they're looking for interest and potential in your subject area and teachability in the Oxbridge system. But you're applying for a specific subject area. Now, I've divided these into four broad categories, and I'll also address a few special cases as well. Some subjects I realize can't be neatly put into any one of these boxes, particularly if you're applying to study multiple subjects. The first category of subjects are socio-political historical, subjects such as PPE, politics, HSPS, human sciences, which overlaps with this category, history I would put in this category, history with politics, geography, law, land economy, so social sciences and historical sciences, where some of the skills are very similar across these subjects. Analytical reasoning, cultural awareness, systems thinking. Questions like, if a law is unjust, is it still wrong to break it? Why or why not? Can studying the past ever truly help us understand the future? Basically, a version of how useful is history? And are protests more effective when they disrupt everyday life? It could also very well be a passage they give you to explore. So my main tip for subjects in this area is that lots of students rely on their knowledge because they're very passionate about a certain area of history or a certain area of politics or geography, and think that their knowledge in that subject is going to make the difference. Instead of that, try to think more in terms of arguments first, content second. So bring in knowledge after you've dealt with the logic of the argument in front of you and whatever resources has been put in front of you. The trick to that is staying very focused on the question, whatever that might be, instead of turning it into a question that you would rather it have been. I find that very well-read students, so people who have already read loads of the first year syllabus, can be very quickly overshadowed by better thinkers, including in the interview. So don't rely on your knowledge here. There's lots of really good resources. So I would recommend if you're a budding historian, check out Cambridge's virtual classroom for history. There's also demonstration interviews you can watch in a few different subjects, history included. You can see this is from I don't actually know which college. I think it's a Cambridge interview, where they're looking at a piece of artwork and discussing it with an applicant who's only just seen it for the first time. For a subject like economics, this is a real economics interview schedule from Oxford from 5 years ago now. It could be a graph that you're shown, and you need to work through a set of questions which relate to that piece of data. Moving on to the logical numerical sciences. So subjects like maths, physics, engineering, computer science, other scientists who might encounter numerical or very logic-based exercises. So here you can expect direct questions, prove that root 2 is irrational, can something be true and still be logically invalid? Notice that's more of a philosophy question. How many squares could be made from a grid of 10 by 10 dots? Ignore diagonal squares. By the way, if you're applying for a subject like economics, you can absolutely expect some of your questions to be more mathematical. My tip here is to practice with problems that stretch your ability, that might combine different areas of maths that you've studied, and practice working through them out loud after you've first seen the problem. So don't give yourself too long to think. Maybe give yourself a set of new problems that you've not seen before and try to work through them. Draw your working out, but try to vocalize your working out at the same time, because that's the skill that most applicants find most unusual. Again, you can watch mock interviews. So this is from Cambridge University. You can see an actual interview that's produced by the university. So biochemical sciences. This area will relate to subjects around biology, chemistry, medicine, biomedical sciences, biochemistry, psychology, and so on. Direct problems also arise in these subjects, and some maths can also be used in these subjects, particularly something like chemistry. But there may also be questions around experimental design and more conceptual debates around the nature-nurture question, potentially ethical questions around experimental design. And if you're applying for a life science like medicine, questions also about clinical decision-making and treatment. Your core syllabus material from school is important to know because you'll be expected to be familiar with it, but you will very frequently move past that and asked to apply what knowledge you have to new situations. So this is not a test of your A-level knowledge or your IB knowledge or equivalent, but it is important to revise that knowledge to make sure that you have it handy. Also practice the relevant skills. So have you practiced sketching basic cell and organ systems if you're applying for biological sciences? Or if you're applying for something which might contain chemistry, organic chemistry formulae? Experimental design, have you reminded yourself of the stages in experimental design? Also, graph sketching for something like natural sciences could be quite common. Even if you're applying for biological natural sciences, you may have more of a mathematical question. And some basic mental maths as well. So you won't have a calculator with you, and you may have to do some mental maths. And believe me, if you're under pressure and you're nervous, then it's more difficult to do that. So try and warm your mental maths up before your interview. There are plenty of mock interviews you can watch in the natural sciences as well, including biological natural sciences. You can see they're looking at some kind of cellular formation here. And here they're looking at an image together. This is a biology demonstration interview from Oxford that you can watch on YouTube. Then finally, we have arts and humanities. So the remaining subjects, English, languages, music, and so on, can be put into this bucket. Can a work of art be good if no one understands it? If a translation changes the meaning of a word for poetic effect, is it still a faithful translation? Can a fictional story tell us more truth than a factual one? My main advice for the arts and humanities is that however good you are at interpreting or coming up with a interpretation for something, a piece of art, before considering that wider context and the wider meaning or implications or comparing it with something, try to deeply examine what is in front of you. The reason for that is because if you have not done that groundwork, you can miss crucial details, which otherwise would have made your analysis much more textured, layered, interesting. And when you're nervous, you are literally less observant. So it's harder to spot those small details. You have to really concentrate and try and take in everything that you can. Excellent students miss these details by trying to jump the gun and trying to say something too impressive. So, for example, this is a poem used by an English admissions tutor at Oxford that we work with. If some people are given a poem like this to read through for a couple of minutes, and asked to talk about it. So, what are your thoughts about this? What do you notice? They may think silently and deeply and then come up with a thesis about how this bird represents the downfall of liberal democracy or another kind of meaning. But I would suggest beginning with looking at the detail of what's in front of you and describing what you actually notice before then going into something more deep. And the reason for that is because this is also a conversation. So they can help to embellish your observations. For instance, the poem begins mid-action, a bird came down the walk. Um, we can see the use of dashes throughout the poem. There's a, B, C, B rhyme scheme. There's quite plain language used. There's certain words that are capitalized. There's quite a visual focus, and so on and so forth. And all of those things can lend themselves into a much more interesting analysis. Those of you applying for art subjects, there's plenty of different things and resources you can use. Again, the Cambridge Virtual Classroom is really useful for English applicants, or even if you're applying for a language or anything that has literature contained within it, classics and so on. The Faculty of English at Cambridge has this virtual classroom which takes you through how they advise to approach unseen material like this, particularly poems. A few special cases. So joint courses like maths and philosophy, economics and management, you should expect interviews in both subjects. So be ready to interview in both. And quite often, especially if it's a joint course and they're equally taught, both interviews will carry equal weight. So it's important if you're an E&M applicant to make sure that you're at least aware of some of the way that academics in management answer questions, for example, or some debates in the discipline. If you're a Cambridge natural science applicant, people are sometimes surprised that they'll have a bit of maths included in their interview, even if they're not applying for physical natural sciences. And even if they're not applying for physical natural sciences, chemistry may come up if you have the A level in chemistry. PPE and PPL, usually at least two disciplines covered, but themes or elements of all the disciplines could be covered. With PPL, it's a bit different because you choose two of those subjects to study in your first year. With PPE, you study all three. In both, the emphasis is still on skills rather than knowledge. My subject, HSPS, it's typical to have two interviews, one that's more politics focused and one that's more sociology or anthropology focused. People are usually applying for HSPS because they're mainly focused on politics and international relations, and forget the sociology and anthropology part. Please try to brush up at least on the methods used in sociology and anthropology, know what those disciplines are, some of the key ideas in those disciplines. Then architecture, fine art, design, where you need to submit a portfolio. Similar in music, if you have to submit a piece of a Bach chorale or something, then they will focus on your submitted portfolio or your submitted work. If you're applying for ab initio languages, that means if you're applying for, let's say, French with ab initio Italian or something similar, a language which you've not formally studied before, they still may want to see some elementary knowledge and some basics that you've brushed up on that language. And medicine and veterinary medicine, the emphasis at Oxford and Cambridge is still very scientific in those subjects, but some vocational questions are possible. After all, it's a long degree and they're training you to become working doctors. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about my top tips for communication in the interview. The first tip is actually about mindset. And I'd like you to shift your mindset from an exam mindset, seeing this interview as an exam, to a learning mindset. So, what's the difference between an exam and a learning mindset? In an exam mindset, this is a one-way process. You're given something to complete. You usually have to show off what you know. There's no feedback or response in the moment. You're usually rewarded for correct answers, things that match their mark scheme. Knowledge is quite important, and it's a solo endeavor. With a learning mindset, the emphasis is on exploration of ideas, new ideas, a back and forth dialogue, particularly in this small group learning setting, adapting to new information, showing curiosity and excitement, and your potential for learning within the supervision system that they're offering. So this is a chance for you to sample what it's like to be a student at this university. 3 C's I want to cover. Clarity, are you being clear? Curiosity, do you seem interested? And connection, are you having a real conversation with the interviewers? You saw when I showed you the assessment forms, even for physics, for English, and the general assessment form used in some Cambridge colleges, communication and motivation hold a really large proportion of the interviewer's assessment of interviewees. So the way that you communicate is really important. Firstly, clarity. Can you be seen, heard, and understood? The obvious thing here is that if you're having an online interview, make sure your technical equipment is working for you, that you're relatively well lit, and your microphone is not a barrier, so test all of that stuff. You don't need to speak in a formal way, speak as yourself. Hesitations, thinking sounds, actually, those sorts of things are very normal and expected. Listen to any academic speaking, and you'll hear the same thing. There are a few common tendencies which work against being clearly understood, which I tend to see. And most of these things are related to being nervous, but it's worth being aware of them. So, first thing there is the tendency to waffle, which is where you keep talking when you maybe don't know what to say. My advice for this, if you find yourself waffling and you don't really know how what you're saying relates to the question anymore, is to stop and lean into the uncertainty. So address the elephant in the room, which is, why don't you know what to say? Are you missing a piece of information? Do you not understand the question? Have you taken enough time to think? Have you not defined a parameter in the question? So lean into the uncertainty. Secondly, is a lack of focus on the question asked. Being focused on the specific question asked is a hugely important thing in academia generally, and when you get to undergraduate level is something that you'll be gaining lots of marks for. Students can talk about the topic in question, kind of generally, without actually addressing or answering the question. So you've got to have heard the question asked properly. And if you haven't, ask for clarification, or if you don't understand it, ask for clarification. And if needed, jot down some key elements of that question on paper. It helps me sometimes to imagine the question physically in front of me when it's asked, so that you can keep a laser focus on answering it. Thirdly, monologuing. This is where interviewees feel they need to give an essay-length kind of verbal answer. Remember, this interview is a dress rehearsal of a tutorial or a supervision. Have a learning mindset. The interviewers want to see what you're going to be like in a situation, so give them space after your points to come back. Fourth is what I call teaching, which is a habit that's somewhat encouraged by GCSE, A-level syllabus, and some school systems, where you're rewarded for being able to remember and relay definitions of terms, so your knowledge. You'll usually be talking to an expert in the field, sometimes a world-leading expert in the field. So teaching them basic concepts in their own subject is not required. So assume knowledge of your interviewers, and they will simply ask if they need any more information. And fifth is being vague, is being too vague. I would really encourage you, where relevant, to try and bring in examples, if you can, to frame your answers. You don't need to go into depth, but bringing in examples, even if they're hypothetical, can add an extra depth to your answers and can help the conversation move along. And it also helps you to reflect and think on the points that you've just made. In some types of interview questions, particularly the direct problem solving questions, the examples are less relevant. If you find yourself doing any of these things, rest assured it's very typical and most applicants will be doing it too, and your interviewers may also be doing it. Second is curiosity. Do you seem interested in the subject? There are two sides to this. First is, have you explored your subject in depth? Can they see evidence of that in your personal statement? What reading have you done? What connections are you making? When you're bringing in examples, that's showing curiosity in the interview. The other side of this is how you seem in the interview, how you're coming across. Sometimes I read personal statements that are full of words like mesmerized, fascinated. I love this subject, but when you speak to the student, they seem like they really don't want to be there or care about the subject. The interviewers in front of you might have investigated a very niche area of academia, string theory or cockroach anatomy or Egyptian archaeology. Every day for the past 30, 40, 50 years, they want to see a spark of that curiosity in you. So when they ask questions about things that you've never thought about before, give it a go. Apply what you do know to what you don't know. And if you do find something interesting, express it. So welcome unfamiliar questions, offer your ideas generously, especially when you don't know the answer to the question. And if you find something interesting, then say so. And thirdly, connection. This one is a little bit more esoteric and a little bit harder to define. But it's that feeling when you're speaking to your interviewer and the interviewer feels like you're speaking to them. Um, there's occasionally the phrase that might come up in after interviews from admissions tutors, which is, well, I want to give that person an offer. I can't tell you exactly why in their answers. I just think I just like them. I think they'd be suitable for this learning system. Questions to ask yourself are you really noticing the interviewers when you talk? If you're not really noticing them, so if you feel like you're talking to yourself, then try to recenter yourself and talk to your interviewers rather than at them. Secondly, as I just mentioned, make an effort to talk to the interviewers, connect with the interviewer, rather than slipping into exam mode and reeling off your answer. And be yourself. Your interviewer is someone, like I've mentioned, who could be your colleague, someone who's going to be working with you through difficult concepts. You'll see them every week in small groups, discuss ideas together, learn together. So take this as your first conversation with your future tutors. Notice them, be curious, and be human. So I've got a few more minutes. I just want to go through some practical tips for what you could be doing from now. Practical steps are, firstly, engage with difficult material. So find university level readings and resources and analyze them. So don't just read them, try to think about them. Where do you find these things? Well, places like JSTOR, Google Scholar, your school library or local library. There are plenty of amazing free resources you can draw on. Secondly, discuss them. So make it routine to discuss and debate with others about your subject. And thirdly, engage actively with your reading. So I've already mentioned you should be analyzing what you're looking at. Think about your own perspective. So do you agree with what you're reading? Do you disagree? Why? How does it build on your knowledge of a certain area? What gaps are there in this scientific area of inquiry? What might you do next? Is this relevant to all contexts or just some? Do you agree with the evidence that they've used about the logic of their argument, and so on and so forth? You will forget this stuff if you do it just in your head, so I would recommend you keep an academic diary of some kind. You may already have one. If you don't, I recommend starting one. Technical stuff, make sure you're in a quiet and focused space with appropriate lighting. That could be at school or it could be at home. If you may be using a whiteboard, which is usually Miro, or it could be something similar. If you're applying for a mathematical subject, practice with that before your interview. You may need a stylus and a tablet for your interview. You'll be told that far in advance. That's again if you're applying for a mathematical subject. Test out your camera and microphone on your laptop. Potentially you could borrow someone else's laptop if you think that might be better, or you can use a school computer or school equipment. And good internet connection as well. You can't always guarantee that, but if you know that you might have slightly weak internet connection or it's a bit temperamental at home, then find somewhere else. So just a few demonstrations of what not to do on in your interview. This is when you're far too close to the camera. This is when you're far too, your lighting is not up to scratch, your bulb is broken. This is when a sibling might have walked into your interview or a parent. This is when you're too far away from the camera. So make sure you're at an appropriate distance and you're well lit and you can be heard. So finally, on the day, wear whatever makes you feel confident. They're not judging you for smartness of your attire. At the same time, I'd probably also say don't wear anything overly distracting, but you're not being judged on what you're wearing. If you feel nervous, use slow breathing Often, if people slow down their breathing, it can help them to calm their nerves. And have a pencil or pen and paper on standby. Because, for example, if the use of the whiteboard fails, or you want to sketch something down and show something to your interviewer, and you've got your interview online, then it can be really handy to have a pencil and paper. I wouldn't go mad trying to remember your notes or revise the day of your interview. I would instead maybe quickly flick through things, but get yourself into a positive, confident, centered mindset, ready to engage your brain to these problems. If I had to give you one piece of advice for your interviews only, it would be to enjoy yourself. You have a chance to speak to world-leading academics in your subject. These discussions should be fun. You should find them fun. The more you can enjoy yourself, the more this comes across, and the more the interviewers will picture you as a student on their course. Practice. Getting mock interviews can be very useful. So ask a teacher or a friend or a family member, or practice by yourself. And mock interviews don't need to take the form of exactly what you'd have at Oxford or Cambridge in order for it to be useful. It can be a discussion, an academic discussion about your subject. So talking about your reading can be really, really good practice for your interviews. We also provide mock interviews. If you want to discuss that or find out more, then go onto our website, oxbridgeapplications.com, contact us. We have a code for 10% discount here, webinar 1610. So today's date, after the word webinar, I'll show that in a moment as well. Here's a resource for you to try. This is our interview gym. So there's 1,000 questions that we've put together here, which are divided into broad different subject areas, which are more leaning towards the critical thinking, broad problems that you can practice talking through to try out those kind of strange, unfamiliar questions and to train your thinking skills. So when you're going through those questions, remember to explore the question before you jump into your answer. I'll give a few more seconds for you to scan this before I start looking at the Q&A. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this talk on interviews. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll try and get through them. But thank you so much for joining. Congratulations for getting your applications off. Good luck with any admissions tests you might need to sit in the next couple of weeks. And get in contact if you have any questions about your interviews. So I will go through some questions now. I